The rate of pupils repeating grades after COVID-19 has dropped by a dramatic 50% for grades 10 and 12 in 2020 compared to 2019. Stellenbosch University researchers attributed this to what it says are relaxed school tests aimed at compensating for learning losses caused by the pandemic. Let's talk about some of the findings, but we will also speak to the Department of Education's monitoring unit to get their views as well. Servaas Van Der Berg is the National Research Foundation South African National Research Chair in the Economics of Social Policy, and Dr. Stephen Taylor is the Director of Research Monitoring at the Department of Education. To the both of you, thank you very much for joining us. Good evening and welcome. Servaas, share more about your findings on the reduction in the grade repetition rate and some of the factors that you found led to that.
Right. The important factor just to take into consideration is that during 2020 and 2021, more than 3/4 of a year of schooling was lost for most children in the system. And as a result of that, it would have been unfair to simply continue as is normal with the assessments that take place, and because it would simply have put some students at a complete disadvantage as a result of something that they had no control over. So it is not unexpected that the Department of Basic Education decided to introduce more lenient testing rules. Amongst others, for instance, in the further education and training phase, that's from grade 10 onwards, the rule was that children should only be tested on the work covered. So work not covered was not to be tested. And as a result of these changes, one found then that the repetition rates, which are extremely high in South Africa, particularly in grade 10, that those declined quite dramatically. So, for instance, in grade 10 in Limpopo province, 42% of learners in grade 10 repeated in 2019. In 2020, that dropped to only 21%. It has since again risen, but it has not gone back to its previous level. As a result of that, there are more children remaining in school, but also flowing through to the higher grades than would have been the case in the past.
Yeah, I mean, we'll interrogate some of those findings as we move on. But before I bring Stephen in, I want to ask, why was this an important line of inquiry for you and your team?
Well, firstly, because we know too little about what happens to learners in our system. Until fairly recently, it was not possible to track learners from one year to the next if they moved between schools, for instance. So as a result of that, we tended to overestimate dropouts, where sometimes children were simply changing school and so forth. So we have better information on that now, and we can track these processes better. But it also allows us to then see how later school performance is related to earlier repetition, to earlier performance in school-based assessment, and so forth.
And certainly we must make time at the end to look at how that particular class of 2021 and 2022 fared once they reached those higher grades, if they managed to move on sequentially year on year. We know, if we cast our minds back, it was a very difficult and unequal time, that whole period. Not all children in schools could make the transition to online transition, and as you say there, Servaas, 3/4 of the year was lost. Stephen, I want to bring you in. When you look at the results of this research, what are you thinking?
Good evening. I think it's very important research, and it corroborates a lot of what we have ourselves found and published on as the Department of Basic Education. Should also be pointed out that the study was conducted using our data. And we've also released our own reports on this. So I think Professor Van Der Berg summed it up quite well in terms of what the findings show, that grade repetition rates actually declined quite substantially during 2020. Off a very high base. So we actually have had a problem perhaps of quite high grade repetition rates by international standards. And when the pandemic hit, these were very unusual times, and we had to change the assessment policies, as the professor explained. This had the effect of increasing grade promotion. And actually, that led to more children staying in school and writing the matric exams. One of the concerns when the pandemic hit us and with all the school closures was that this would lead to increased dropout. And it turned out to not be the case. It turned out that we actually kept children in school more. More children wrote matric, importantly. And your point about how did they do in the NSC exams of 2021 and 2022 is an important question, because it turned out that we actually had more passes, more bachelor passes than ever before. So I think what happened is that this was a positive unintended consequence of the pandemic, where we actually kept more children in school for longer and they had a good opportunity to write their matric exams.
Stephen, so important what you just shared with us there in terms of the outcome of doing, of making a decision in an extraordinary context, not knowing how it would pan out. Because logically, you think that if kids missed out on their schooling days, they would be at be disadvantaged in the ensuing grades. Contrary to that expectation, it seems to have worked out a little bit differently, because not only did they stay in school, but they actually managed to, on average, achieve the results that they should be achieving in those higher grades. What's the big lesson for you out of this, Stephen? And then I'll put a similar question to Servaas.
Yes, well, it's not as if the pandemic didn't hurt children. The school closure certainly did come at a cost, and it seems like the biggest cost was in terms of learning in some of the earlier grades. But a fortuitous result was the way that we were actually able to reduce grade repetition, which in itself sometimes is a factor that can lead to dropping out as children become overaged. And more children had the opportunity to represent themselves in the matric exams. So I think there are some lessons about how to perhaps reduce grade repetition rates in the future. And give more children an opportunity to write the matric exams. And it should also be pointed out that the grade 12 requirements remained unchanged. The weighting of school-based assessment marks relative to exams marks, that remained unchanged, and the matric processes remained unchanged as well.
Yeah. Well, Servaas, I'm going to give the final word to you. There were so many gems in your research. Unfortunately, we can't get to all of that now, and it relates to, things like how schools responded in terms of curriculum coverage, how some of the practices that they implemented in terms of the way assessments are done also were impacted and give us a lot of lessons for how learning and grading that learning should be done in future. I'd like to hear, from your perspective, what some of the important lessons are here based on the outcomes of your research.
Well, yes, perhaps one of the interesting things that occurred during this period was that the percentage of children electing to do mathematics literacy rather than mathematics declined, which I think is, in the circumstances, the appropriate thing to have happened, because many of those learners would probably in the past have struggled with those subjects. Those were typically the learners that did not pass in the past. So I think there was perhaps greater selectivity in who chose to do mathematics rather than mathematics literacy. And I think that is important. One finds still that in some provinces there's a far greater propensity to encourage learners to do mathematics, even if they had performed poorly in grade 9 in mathematics. So for instance, one finds that in Limpopo and the Eastern Cape, we have much higher percentages of learners continuing with mathematics rather than mathematical literacy compared to Gauteng, which is not what one would expect given the backlog that many of those learners have. So I think that that's an important part of what we learned through this. But what we also got the first stab at with utilizing this very rich data set was that we could better understand how school-based assessments are linked to performance later in the school career. So we could learners over time, and also how that impacted on their matric performance.
We'll certainly be having a lot more conversations this year about education. I want to appreciate the pair of you for your time. Servaas Van Der Berg is the National Research Foundation's South African National Research Chair in the Economics of Social Policy, and Dr. Stephen Taylor is the Director of Research Monitoring at the Department of Education.